The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. So begins the Dark Tower Saga, and so begins the Gunslinger, Stephen King's The Gunslinger, the first volume in the Dark Tower series. Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we are talking about Stephen King once again. I'm reading every book by Stephen King. I'm reading them in publication order. I've read through the 1970s. I'm into the early 80s now. And now we have arrived at 1982 and The Gunslinger by Stephen King. So this book was originally published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction as a series of connected short stories. They were put together as a hardcover, The Gunslinger, which was the first volume in the Dark Tower series. When he started this book, or with this series, of course, being Stephen King, he had no idea how it was going to end up, how the series would progress. So eventually, he did have to revise this novel. So the version I have here is the revised version of The Gunslinger. He had to change some things to make the beginning fit the end. And he did alter the character a little bit of Roland, the gunslinger. And I think most of the changes that he made in this book were, for the most part, pretty good changes. He didn't ruin anything. Basically, he made the series a stronger series, and I think he made this a stronger book, at least from what I understand. I did read the first version of this years and years ago, and I read the first two books of the Dark Tower series. To be honest, I don't remember much about them. I was pretty young when I read them. But I did read the original version of The Gunslinger, and I do remember just how ruthless Roland was in that original version. His character was changed when the revisions were made for this book. And like I said, I think the changes were good changes. I think they work for the story. Certainly they make Roland more interesting, I think. Roland, the gunslinger, who is pursuing the man in black and the secret of the Dark Tower itself. That is what this book is about. It takes place in a fantasy world, which is somehow connected to our own, although different. This world has moved on, and it's very different from our own. It's interesting that when Stephen King got around to writing his own fantasy stories, that he did it in the way that he did it. Stephen King, in the introduction of this volume, talks about how much he enjoyed The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but that when it came time for him to do his own fantasy series, which he wanted to do, he couldn't do it in that way. He had to do it differently. And it's interesting how he went about doing it. Stephen King has always struck me as being a very American writer, with very American concerns. And so it shouldn't be a surprise, I guess, that when he went about writing his own fantasy series, he used the imagery and some of the tropes and some of the characters that you would find in an American Western and put them in his fantasy series. The Western, of course, is the most American of genres. And this is something that might not have worked. This could have just fallen flat. It could have not worked at all, but it does work, which kind of surprises me. You know, even though I had read this once before when I was younger, I kind of expected when I read it this time that I'd be kind of disappointed in it, that maybe it just wouldn't work. But it does work. He does an excellent job of creating this world. It's a strange world. It's sort of a dreamlike world, at least in this opening volume. It's weird, yet it works. You believe it while you're reading it. At least I did. And to me, that's the sign of a good fantasy novel. If you believe it while you're reading it. If you're invested in the story while you're reading it. And I certainly was. It's a simple story. The plot is a pretty simple one. Roland is trailing the men in black and the Dark Tower itself. What will he do to fulfill his quest? What will he sacrifice to reach the man in black and the Dark Tower? What will the repercussions be of the choices that he makes? All these are questions. And by the end of this book, you really, really want to know where this story goes. You really want to continue on with this series. So, as an introductory volume, it's a really good one. It's short. Much shorter than all the other books in the series. But for me at least, it's a really good introduction to this series. I'm aware that there are a lot of Stephen King fans who they don't like these books as much, at least, as his other work. That is understandable. Most of Stephen King's work takes place in a recognizable world, ours. This is very much, at least in this opening volume, a fantasy world. And so I can see why that would be off-putting to somebody who's just not into fantasy. But even if you're not, this is an interesting read. It takes a little bit to get acclimated to this world. That's the way it is with fantasy and science fiction. You kind of walk in cold and you have to figure things out. How does this world work? And there is that in this. And it's weird because so much of it is like the Old West and things that we are familiar with from Old Westerns, but also very different. So that is interesting also. Just the way this is presented, the way he created this world, it's really interesting. And all the changes I think that he made in this to revise the story were good ones. So I do highly recommend this book. I was really happy with it. I liked it a lot more than I thought I would, and I definitely want to see what happens to Roland and his quest for the Dark Tower. So yeah, I've got little Stephen King with me. Good job, little Stephen King. I like this one. It's a good little book that continues on into a gigantic fantasy series. We'll see how it goes. So I will be reading all those books in the future. I think the next Stephen King book I'm going to be reading is Different Seasons, which is very different from this one. But I do highly recommend this. Okay, that's all I have to say about this particular book at this particular time. Okay, guys, you have a great day.